I've been working on this book for almost 30 years, on and off. It was actually going to be a coffee table book with Randy Juster, who did the 16 gorgeous color plates in here. He's the best Art Deco, decobooks.com, by the way. It's fabulous stuff. And we had an agent and an assistant editor who came in and said, I love this book. We're going to do this book. I just need to get clearance from my boss. And I said, well, that's great. We're so young, we're going to have a book. And then a week later, very sort of sheepishly, he came back and said, well, I'm so sorry, but my boss said, this is a local interest subject. Never bring me a book like this again. The editor's name was Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, who was instrumental in rescuing Grand Central Terminal, which I believe is a local interest train station. In any case, it's much better as a guidebook. You know, we all know what Art Deco is. Sometimes it's hard to explain what it is, but we know it when we see it. These buildings, especially ones built around 1930-31, are just so critical to our image of the city, especially today. From the Chrysler Building, if not the most famous hotel, it's certainly one of the top 2 or 3 hotels in New York, the Waldorf Astoria, the great twin-towered apartment buildings that give Central Park West, that make Central Park West the great residential skyline of Manhattan. And they take their name, and I don't know how much of this you've already gotten while I wasn't here, but just very quickly recap, from this famous exposition that happened in Paris with a very long French name, which translates as the International Exposition of Modern Industrial and Decorative Arts. This is a poster from the show. There it is in French, which I can't do. And it was lay asleep until 1966, when a couple of curators at the Museum of Decorative Arts in Paris put on a show called Les Années 25, which I can't do that in French. And they looked at a lot of things. They looked at the Bauhaus, so right there, the Style, right, that's Holland, and then they looked at this Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et d'Histoire Moderne, and my theory is it wouldn't fit on the cover. So they shortened it to Art Décoratif, which is simply decorative arts, and again, this is just my theory, that didn't fit either, so voila, Art Deco, the expression, was born. So that was 1966. In 1968, Bevis Hillier, who was an arts writer for the Times of London, he was later editor of the Connoisseur magazine, if anyone remembers the old Connoisseur magazine. He wrote a book on French furnishings, I think, and he called it Art Deco. And then here in New York, in 1970, Finch College, I don't know if anyone remembers Finch College, it closed in the mid-70s, but it was on Madison, in the 70s off Madison Avenue. It was an avant-garde arts college for young women. And they had a lot of avant-garde professors, and they had a gallery with an avant-garde curator named Elaine Varian. And she put on a show in 1970, objects, not architecture. She did architecture a few years later. And she called it Art Deco. And you know, no one knew what this stuff really was, and she had to scrounge around to find collectors. And one of the collectors she found was Barbara Streisand, who was apparently an early collector of this stuff. She also found, man, his name I can never remember, but he designed that 1930s streamlined turnstile in the subways. And he had a collection she borrowed from him. All right, so Bevis Hillier came over the next year, had lunch with Elaine, so I'm told. Borrowed her stuff, added some more, took it out to Minneapolis to the Institute of Arts and put on a show called The World of Art Deco. And suddenly Art Deco was everywhere. By the way, the critics panned these shows. This is modernism. Modernism is pure, austere, all ornament is crime. That's modernism. This is just junky stuff from the Depression. Who cares? And the rest of us ignored them and started to fall in love with these things. I remember coming back to New York from graduate school and not having a name for it yet, but with a friend of mine going around and saying, oh look, there's a 30s building. That was the best we could do, call it a 30s building. We stood in front of Rockefeller Center and said, I think those are 30s buildings. And then this wonderful cartoon came out. Do you realize we were living for the second time people got tired of Art Deco? But the joke is that it appeared in 1984, which is 33 years ago, so apparently we're still getting tired of it. So what is it? Well, we all know it when we see it. It's been applied to everything from skyscrapers to salt cellars, fabrics, jewelry, painting, sculpture, collectibles of all description. Anything with an abstract geometric pattern or a stylized floral pattern, something that looks natural but you won't find in nature quite like that. Anything like that designed in the late 1920s or the early 1930s. Or the mid-1930s, or the late 1930s, the early 40s, the mid-40s, the late 50s, a few odds and ends into the early 50s. So anything like that, it's a fair chunk of time. So anything like that in that period of time in Europe and North America, or South America, or South Africa, even Egypt, I think the wrong style got called the international style. It's such a widely used term that people, what does it even mean? So historians have tried to parse it down. We've all heard about the Miami Beach Art Deco district, I'm sure. Their entire economy seems to be based on this phrase. So there's a professor somewhere in South Florida who gets really upset when anyone calls Miami Beach Art Deco. No, 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 she says, that is not Art Deco. Well, what is it? It's resort moderne. So now you know. Academics who, like the rest of us, have to keep busy. When it comes to architecture, though, in New York City, it's a very specific phenomenon, and it's a style that really coalesced at first in Skyscrapers. It is not an accident that the first serious book on the subject of Art Deco architecture in New York was called Skyscraper Style. Rosemary Hogbletter and Elizabeth Robinson, still a fabulous book.
That I mentioned to them.
What can I say? Great minds. I want to start with the work of Raymond Hood, not because he's a classic Art Deco architect, you can argue maybe he even isn't, but we know a lot about how the designs of his buildings came together, and they pull together what becomes Art Deco. We know a lot about this building, the Daily News building, because there's a biography. A young architect named Walter Killam Jr. went to work for Hood in 1929, and then wrote a book about the master later on, so he recounts all of the office discussions. So the first thing you notice about this building, I think, is that it's a skyscraper. It's tall. And you think, well, of course it's tall. It's a skyscraper. But we're in the Skyscraper Museum. Why wouldn't it be tall? But it wasn't going to be. When Hood brought his plans to Captain Patterson, the head of the Daily News, Captain Patterson said, I didn't ask for a skyscraper. I'm a newspaper man. I need a printing plant and a couple of floors of offices, and I need to be able to get my papers to Times Square before the competition. Why did you bring this to me? And Hood apparently said, well, sir, you see, you're not in construction. It's very expensive here in New York, but if you build a skyscraper, you can rent out all the extra space and it'll pay for everything, something like that. And apparently he talked the man into buying a skyscraper. Now, why do that? Well, I think most New York architects certainly dream of doing skyscrapers. That's our most famous building type. Architects get paid a percentage of construction costs. You can do quite well. But we learned from Killam that this had to do with Hood's idea about building. Hood believed that New York architecture, by which he really meant Manhattan, was fake, false, phony, not really architecture. What's he talking about? Well, look at a typical street of cast iron lofts in Soho, or a row of brownstones, or tenements on the Lower East Side. They all have nice designs, but they're all on the front. If you want to know, well, how far back in the lot do they go? You can guess, but you can't see. What shape is it behind there? Again, you can guess, but you can't see. From Hood's point of view, this may be lovely stuff, but it's two-dimensional. And architecture is three-dimensional. So this isn't really architecture. Well, how do you get around that issue in a city like New York? Well, one way is you build your building as a skyscraper, and then at least at some point it towers over the neighbors, and you get to see it in the round. But there's more. You'll notice that as we're looking at it from the 41st Street side, you'll notice that we can see the 41st Street side just fine, but we can also see this whole western front because it seems to be on a corner. Corner of what? Is there a street there? No, there is not. There is an alley there, and it wasn't there. Raymond Hood put it there. We learned this from Killam, that he approached, on behalf of the Daily News, he approached the other property owner and said, you know, if we give up a little of our lot and you give up a little of your lot, we'll have this nice service alley. What do you say? And so it happened. But Killam tells us that what he was really thinking was, I want people to be able to see this side of the building. I want you to be able to see it in the round. And then the third reason is the setbacks. Where is the corner on this building? It's kind of hard to pin down. And that's because of the setbacks. Your eye can't stop at the corner. You see it in three dimensions. That's because, in large part, because of the zoning resolution of 1916. I think all of us know that we're the first city to have it. Mostly it's about zones. This is an industrial zone, you can't build a house there, that kind of thing. But skyscrapers were going up in these narrow streets in Manhattan, lower Manhattan, laid out by the Dutch 4 centuries ago. And when enormous tall buildings go up on very narrow streets, sunlight is disappearing from the streets. It wasn't really about the pedestrians, by the way. It was about the office buildings across the street who were suddenly having the light, the natural light lighting their offices, disappear and losing their financial value. That's what it was about. This is the 120 Broadway, the Equitable Life, the last building to go up before this big building to go up before the zoning, and you can see it just started at the corner, went straight up. It just this enormous thing. So the new zoning that was in place really from 1916 to 1961 changed that. They didn't do a height limit. We've never had an absolute height limit in New York. Other cities have had them. Chicago once had one, not in New York, of course, but not in New York. Apparently, we like height. So instead we got, and I'm sure you all know this, the famous zoning. It's the formula. It's based on the width of the street, the area of the lot, and I think a number assigned to this part of town by the zoning resolution. You can start building right there and go straight up, but only to a certain point. And then the law defines a diagonal. And most people do not build on diagonals, so you get the setbacks. And so you go up, back, up, back, up, back, until what you're building up in the sky occupies no more than 25% of the lot at the ground, and then you can go up until it makes financial sense to stop. So that, if this is from the 50s, if there is an aesthetic behind this design of this building, I think it would be form follows zoning envelope. Well, the Daily News building doesn't look like that. Here are the zoning came in 1960, no one was building, really, so architects had some time to think about what can we do with it. There's a famous set of drawings by Hugh Ferris showing these extraordinarily romantic ideas of what you could do under the new zoning. So Hood had a model made up of what was possible under the site. And then Killam tells the story of walking into the office and seeing Hood standing in front of one of these models with a carving knife in his hand, and he turned to Killam and said something like, "Oh, don't mind me, I'm just doing a little zoning," and proceeded to carve pieces off. He was carving it like a piece of abstract sculpture. This is something that is going to be common to Art Deco buildings, that you see it in the round and it's like a piece of abstract sculpture. And in this case, it's asymmetrical, so it looks different from every angle. It's hard to describe it. It's visual, it's not verbal. But this is 41st Street, so we go up 6 stories, and then at the corner, there's a little shallow setback, just one window bay deep, and then we go up 2 more stories, and then there's this deep one over here, and then a shallow one up there. But over here, it's different. It goes up 5 stories, and it's shallow, and from a different angle, it's again completely different. But it is like a piece of abstract sculpture, and if we shrunk it down to 10 feet tall, put it on a base, we could stick it in the Museum of Modern Art, and I think it would fit nicely. Then the windows. Now, we think of windows as being inside because that's where we are when we open and close them, but of course they're also outside. And in 1929, there were really only 2 ways to do windows. There was the horizontal way and there was the vertical way. In the horizontal way, this is a good example, the thinking goes something like this. What is an office building? What's a tall building? It's a series of floors stacked one on top of another, floor, floor, floor. If a building should look like what it is in that regard, what should it look like? It should look like a series of floors. How do I get that look at the windows? I put them in horizontal bands, and there we get this wonderful look, floor, floor, floor. Perfectly valid way to do it, but it's not the only way. The other way, we might say the more romantic way, certainly the Art Deco way, goes back to Louis Sullivan in Chicago. Sullivan wrote, what is a skyscraper? It is a tall, proud thing soaring in exaltation. Tall, proud thing. In other words, now this is my words, not his, look what we're doing. No one's ever built skyscrapers before. This is America's contribution to world architecture, for better or worse. Who cares about floor, floor, floor? That's boring. I want people to look at my buildings and look up and say, wow, look how tall that is. And how do I do that with the windows? I put them in vertical stripes. Yes, and the way that's done is very simple. The windows are recessed, not a lot, 3 or 4 inches, behind these uninterrupted piers. And the result is this vertical look. Now remember, architects did not have the phrase Art Deco to describe what they were doing. What do they call this style? Well, they called it modern. They called it moderne, which is French for modern. They called it modernistic, which means kind of modern. They called it the vertical style. And this is something that's going to be true even on 6-story apartment houses in the Bronx. It's going to be vertically oriented windows. What about the ornament? Well, the Daily News is not typical of Art Deco buildings and having, it's not like the Chrysler building, tons of ornament. But what ornament there is, compared to the Tudor City over here, which is actually named for an historic style, right? This is what New York was doing until Art Deco came along. Basically saying, what are they doing in Europe? We'll do that over here. This is why our history of New York architectural styles goes 1820s Greek Revival, 1830s Egyptian Revival, 1840s Gothic Revival, 1850s Italian, 1920s the Everything Revival, and it's sort of pasted on these great big Tudory things. And there's none of that over here. That's thrown out, and instead what we get is color. Now all buildings have color. We don't live in a black and white world. But in New York, that color is often monotone, and often gray. Not here. White, red, and black. And the red and the black sort of merge as you look further up the building. It just becomes like a dark red. And originally there were red pull shades here. And at night especially, it was just a red and white striped building. Someone said it looked like a lantern in a parade. Completely transformed the way people thought about building a skyscraper. The ornament shows up here. Hood wrote that he and the owner were agreed that given a limited budget, I think it was $150,000, that they would get the greatest effect. One of his favorite words. Today we would say the greatest bang for the buck, if they put it all in one place. So they put it on the outside here and then in the lobby. This is a light fixture which has now been relit. It was dark for a while. And this is this extraordinary relief. And here's a close-up. And this is also typical of Art Deco. You know, buildings talk to us if we're willing to listen. Some of them whisper, some of them shout. The Art Deco buildings do this thing where they're going to tell us who they are and what they're about. It's not only in this period that happens, but it particularly happens in this period. So here on this side, these are the people of a busy city. Of course, it's 1930, so this is they're dressed in period clothing. This young woman in a short skirt and that footy cap is a flapper. She's buying a newspaper, guess which one? This fellow is a very stout fellow, and I think that's a Hamburg. He is probably a businessman, a capitalist. That, in the top hat, that's Abe Lincoln, President Lincoln. And this is the second half of a quotation ascribed to him. He made so many of them. So what's the first half? Well, there are two versions. One version has it that Lincoln said, God must have loved the common people. He made so many of them. Patterson considered himself, the head of the news, considered himself a socialist. He had a tabloid to reach the masses. So you can see how this might appeal to him. The other version has it that what Lincoln really said was, God must have loved common-looking people. He made so many of them. Lincoln was a homely guy. So we just let that off, and New Yorkers, readers of the Daily News. And then here's the new city being born. Because 42nd Street was like a major construction site, thanks to the new Grand Central Terminal, which had opened in 1913. It was being transformed from a kind of down-at-heels residential district to a modern office building district, and it was just one huge construction site with these great big modern vertical buildings going up on all sides, and tallest of all is this great big striped building in the center with the sun rising behind it, and if you don't know which striped skyscraper that might be, there is its name in great big block letters, The News. So it's told you, the building isn't just, the building is actually part of the ornament. This happens over and over again in the skyscrapers. The lobby used to look like this before this wall came down. That's what it looks like now. It's not too bad, but it was really a self-contained, it was like going to the planetarium. If you haven't been, you must go. But there's this pit here with the globe, which actually rotates. It's at the right angle. It hasn't been repainted since the Soviet Union. I think they're waiting for the dust to settle before they paint it. Boundaries. These are the points of the compass. These are the lines with the names of cities and how far they are. And these are charts, science charts and things like that. Now, supposedly this was, the Daily News has always said that this was Patterson's idea. This is, he was educating his readers. According to Killam, it was Hood's idea. And when Hood proposed it, Patterson, and I quote, snorted and said, science charts, weather charts, New Yorkers don't want any of that. They want murder charts. How many people were killed this week? And maybe he was right. But this became very, very popular. It also starred as the natural choice that the Daily News should star as the Daily Planet with the globe in Superman. All right, so that's 1929. Let's go back to 1923-24. Hood's first building in New York after coming back from his successful victory in the Chicago Tribune competition in 1922. And this building is still, you know, it's got a foot in both worlds. Here's the model, here is as it's built. You know, you look at the door, look, this could be the back door of a French provincial church. These are little gargoyles. This is still sort of like the old Gothic-y architecture. Until you take a closer look at it and you realize that it's actually different. First of all, there's the corner curves, it's chamfered to make sure that our eye goes around. This is a mid-block 20-story building. It's not on a corner, it's not on an alley. But it manages to make it look like you can see it in 3 dimensions. Up at the top, you know, I'm sorry, too quickly. What looks Gothic is actually more like geometric patterns. And of course, there are the vertical windows, and then there's the application of color, black and gold. No one had seen a black and gold building. New Yorkers came by the hundreds to gawk at the building at night because nothing like it had been seen. It was also very dramatically lit, like this. And Georgia O'Keeffe painted this wonderful painting, and apparently she saw right through the Gothic charade and said, no, 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 and she saw the verticality and the geometry. She saw where it was going. He moved his office in here, by the way, when it was over, so it's signed, Raymond Hood Architect, 1924. There used to be a 4-leaf clover up here, I think, for good luck. That disappeared about 15 years ago. I think it must be on somebody's mantle somewhere. It's a shame. All right, now, Hood's partner in the Daily News building was John Howells, an older architect who'd done a lot more traditional stuff before getting involved with Hood, I think. This is his Panhellenic Tower. It's been converted. It's now called the Silver Suites or something like that. And it's interesting to compare it to the Tribune Tower, the one that got Hood started in 1922. The top of this is not just looking Gothic, it's specifically modeled on the Butter Tower at Rouen Cathedral. But you can still see things sort of popping out. Here's the verticality. Here's a chamfered corner. Put these three buildings together. There's the Tribune Building, 1922. That's Howells. Here's Hood's building, 24, the Radiator Building, and then now it's Howells again at Panhellenic in 27. And it's as though this new modern form is sort of throwing off the Gothic look. It's like a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis. And here, the Gothic is pretty much gone. It's almost like you can see the form being born. All right, this is everybody's favorite Art Deco building. We all know this is an Art Deco building. I think we all see, I think most of us see the Daily News building as an Art Deco building, and they look nothing alike. And to me, this is one of the most interesting things about this phenomenon. Any two Art Deco skyscrapers look less alike than any two Gothic cathedrals. Right? Because so much of it is about making up new, inventing new ornament. This building you certainly see in the round because it takes up half a city block. It's got this wonderful sort of square in-plan tower, and then it sets back in these extraordinary receding curves with these wonderful triangular windows until you get to that extraordinary spire. There is color here, not so much the brick. Yes, the white and gray brick. The color really comes here from the metal. This was the first major use of metal on a skyscraper for a very simple reason. There's lots of metal in architecture in New York, not too far from Soho or Tribeca, tons of cast iron buildings. Cast iron requires maintenance. You have to paint it. If you don't paint it, what happens? It rusts. If it rusts and you don't do anything about it, it falls off. Who's going to walk next to a 60-story skyscraper worrying about rusty metal falling on their head? This is possible because this is a non-rusting alloy of nickel, chrome, and steel. This was also a hallmark of the period, experimentation in different materials. In metals, the rusta, which is what this is called, monel, which is still made, by the way, nickel silver, which is neither nickel nor silver. In collectibles, it was more like bakelite and things like that. But that's what made it possible to get there on a sunny day, and the silvery glow from here is just stunning. That's where the color comes from. The identity of the building, these are some of the most famous automotive symbols on any skyscraper. This thing that looks like a loving cup with wings is, in fact, there it is, the hood ornament of a 1929 Chrysler. They're very, very clearly done. And this is the tires. Those are the hubcaps, and that's the running board. Now, generally you don't see that unless you stop and look up. It's not quite as in your face as the Daily News building is. That comes inside an extraordinary lobby, which is really hard to photograph because it's triangular. The ceiling is not, and it's perfectly flat. It just looks that way. And I don't have all the photos I wish I had. There's a whole piece here that shows the construction of the building. And then here is the building itself. Once again, the building itself is part of the ornament. We're going to see this again and again in these buildings. The Empire State Building. We don't think of this as Art Deco because it's the Empire State Building. I think the style is almost beside the point. Also, the silhouette was changed rather dramatically by the addition of this TV mast. Here's the original. And if you don't have the mast, suddenly it looks sort of stubby and geometric. That's really the intention of the architect. The architect, by the way, William Land of Shreve, Land, and Harmon, I interviewed his widow in 1981. I was at the Landmarks Commission doing a report on this building, and she was around, and I don't know quite how I found her, but I did, and she was very kind and invited me to her enormous apartment on the Upper East Side, and said, well, Bill didn't really bring back work from the office, but she had a few things to tell me, one of which was that he hated what we would now call Art Deco. He called the Chrysler Building the Little Nemo School of Architecture. It's kind of like a comic strip of some kind. His idea of beautiful architecture were the austere Romanesque cathedrals of the south of France. Nevertheless, there's no question that this is a Little Nemo building. There are the vertical windows. They're encased in, I think that's the rust, but certainly are encased in some sort of metal. You get the receding setbacks until you certainly see it around, and it rises to this extraordinary, this can't be called anything but Art Deco, I'm sorry, Mr. Lamb. The famous dirigible mooring mast, which really never was used as a mast for dirigibles. It was to make sure that it was taller than the Chrysler building, and there's nothing inside there, by the way, except an elevator and a spiral staircase. If you go to the Empire State Building to this day, they will tell you it's 102 stories tall. Do not believe them. It's 86 stories to here. That's the actual building. This doesn't have stories in it, so they say, well, that's the equivalent in height of 14, so let's see, 14 and 86 is 100. Oh, yes, there are 2 sub-basements. This is New York. This is how we do things. Inside, this is the small part of the lobby. It's set up almost like a chapel. And at the far end of the chapel is this extraordinary silhouette. There, again, the building is part of the ornament, this wonderful silhouette by Oscar Bach, who was one of the great metal workers of the day. And the sun is rising behind it again. That was a popular meme of the time. And it's superimposed on a map of New York State. Why? Well, because it's the Empire State. New York State is the Empire State. It's the Empire State because the president of the building was Al Smith, the former governor of New York State who just lost the presidential election in 28. He was a friend of the developers, and he said, I'll give you a job, Al. You can be the president. So that's the name, and therefore that's the altarpiece. Less well known, but really almost as fantastic as the Chrysler building, the RCA, which almost immediately became the GE building at 570 Wax, has all the things we've talked about. You certainly see it in the round because it takes up a huge chunk of a block. You get that rises up, there are the vertical windows. The setbacks, in this case, the setbacks are a little bit more complex. They jut out in the center, which does the same thing as the vertical window. It's a way of leading our eye up into the tower. At the top of the tower, it looks Gothic. Isn't. It's geometric patterns, and there is this face with quite what the flames coming out of it. And what you can't see, because it's very long, is a lightning bolt going down here. It's 50 feet long. She is the spirit of radio. Well, if you get up this high, I don't know who ever saw this. You'd be in a helicopter to really get a good look at it. But she is the symbol of radio. This is a big budget building, and they really were into the ornaments. So everywhere you look, there are interesting things happening with the brick and the stone. So I've got a better one. Yes, look, this is a hand holding the lightning bolt. These two hands are also holding the lightning bolt, behind which is the light, lights up the GE clock. Downtown, Ralph Walker, one of the great architects doing this sort of thing in this time, famous for his telephone company buildings, but I think famous most of all for one of Wall Street. And again, you see it in the round, it's all about massing and fenestration. There are the vertical windows. But they're not just vertical, they're actually concave. Walker called this a curtain wall. He didn't mean a wall, he didn't mean a sheet of glass hanging on a building. That's what we think a curtain wall is. He meant a wall that looks like a curtain. It ripples like a curtain ringing down on a Broadway stage. There is the entrance, and sort of, you might call it Gothic modern. It was trying to relate apparently to Trinity Church across the street. And inside this extraordinary roof, which no one's been able to see for years now. Maybe one day it'll be open to the public. Since it's becoming condominiums, I kind of doubt it. But this is all mosaics, designed by Walker or his office, but executed by Hildreth Mier, who has her own book out now if you're interested in her. There's a close-up of the mosaics. They start out dark, sort of red and gold here, and they gradually get lighter until they get up to the top. Why? It's all about raising our eye until we see the top. It's the vertical style, even here. All right, this is probably everybody's favorite picture from this period. There are the architects of the day dressed as their buildings, and while that might seem kind of silly and egotistical, these architects had just finished in just a space of 3 or 4 years, because really 27 to 31, most of them went up, just 4 years. They transformed Manhattan. They transformed the skyline. The city suddenly looked different. Art Deco happened at a particular time in our history. New York's an old city by North American standards, 400 years old. In 1898, when we got this city of 5 boroughs, we were a large Victorian city. Think about that for a minute. Was there a President Victoria? No, there was Queen Victoria. The fact that we call it Victorian tells us how we sort of saw ourselves back then. A provincial casting off from England. That changes after World War I. Suddenly, New York emerged after World War I as this modern metropolis, and having this great boom called the Roaring '20s. And it wasn't just that New Yorkers thought of it as a modern metropolis. Hollywood made sure that the world saw it as a modern metropolis. And what was the very modern-looking thing transforming the look of the city? It's what we call Art Deco. This is the style of New York as the 20th century modern metropolis. And these are the guys who made it happen. They could have their customers. So once Skyscraper stopped, 1932, that was it. It didn't matter. The style continued in all kinds of other buildings. Apartment houses especially. Here's Central Park West. This is 55. This is another one that does the changing color, going from dark to light, with Schwartz and Gross. If you look carefully, you can see where the brick color changes. There's also this wonderful cast stone here. I've always thought this looks like flames licking up the facade of the building. The Century Apartments, which is Irwin Channing with Jacques Delamar. By this time, Channing has his own license, so he's really involved in this. And the details like this, the casement windows happen to be popular for all kinds of buildings at the time, but they work really well with Art Deco buildings because they fit the geometry. And in this case, all vertical lines, and look what they do with the brick. Little pieces of brick come out crossed like that to make sure that the vertical line of the casement is carried on down. You're not supposed to notice that. Who's got time to sit and look at, you're walking down the sidewalk, who's going to look at that? But it affects the way we experience the building anyway, subconsciously, unconsciously, however it is. Two others on Central Park West went up in the same style with the Twin Towers, the Majestic at 71st, 72nd, and the El Dorado at 9. It says 92nd, but it's really 90th. I've got to fix that. The same form shows up at the Waldorf Astoria, which actually looks more Twin Towery in this rendering than it does in person because of the way it was done. It's not parallel to Park Avenue, it's perpendicular, so you don't really see it that way. But here's what the skyline now looks like. This is brand new. Downtown, the skyline got additions. Midtown, the skyline got created, right, in this period. And there's the GE building, and there's the Waldorf, and there's the Chrysler building, and there's the Chandler building. And the New York Central building is stuck in the mud, still trying to be, vaguely classical to match Grand Central, but it's definitely the outlier. And it's a total change. And it affected every other part of the city. Here's the Grand Concourse, built up for the returning veterans from World War I in very, I don't want to say dull, but dull styles, with little bits of European-inspired architectural ornament sort of pasted on. Very sedate. Then comes the Daily News building. And there's the new concourse. And they're 6-story buildings, and that somehow they're vertical, and you see them in the round, and they suggest some abstract sculpture. I mean, look at this one, it's got a negative tower in it, right? This suggests a tower that isn't there. Really very clever stuff. Now, how did that happen? Well, this is the first Art Deco apartment house, as far as I can tell. It's built in the Bronx. It's Park Plaza Apartments, it's right across the street from the new Yankee Stadium. Horace Ginsburg and Associates. I got assigned to write its official landmarks report in 1981, and back then there was no internet. I mean, there was no ProQuest. I mean, there was nothing. Where am I going to find information on it? So I opened the phone book, and just let's see. And I looked up Horace Ginsburg and Associates, and they were still there. They're not anymore, but they were still in the phone book. So I called them up, and I got the receptionist, and I said, do you have any old drawings or correspondence about some of your old buildings? And she said, well, I really don't know, but you should speak to Mr. Fine. Oh, who's Mr. Fine? Well, he's been here longer than anybody. I said, okay, made an appointment with Mr. Fine. Come the day, I was about 30. He was in his 80s. I walked into the office, and there he was. He pulled all the drawings up from the vault, and he was looking at them with this smile on his face because it was the first thing he'd ever designed. And he was thrilled that somebody cared and was asking him about it. And he showed me some of the earlier designs, and they were classic, and they were Gothic. And so I asked him, well, what changed, why did you do this? This is the first one, as far as I can tell in the Bronx. What changed your mind? Why did you do this? And he said, well, I'll tell you. I went to a lecture, an architect I thought was really interesting, Bill Van Allen. That would be William Van Allen, the architect of the Chrysler building. And I really liked what he was doing. And there was this other fellow, short little guy with gray hair, Raymond Hood. And our office was across the street from the construction side of the Daily News building. And we watched it go up. And I remember seeing, that thing he does with the brick and the spandrel? And I remember saying to Horace, we should use that as like a trademark on our work on the Grand Concourse. So there it is from the horses. And the result is what you see. It's actually quite a large structure. 4 or 5, I forget how many of these, I think it's 5, separate blocks so that they seem like you see them in 3 dimensions. Certain vertical windows. This is the Daily News building spandrel. This is Park Plaza. They're not identical, but they're very similar in spirit. In this case, these actually zigzag in and out of us. And then there's this wonderful terracotta. I mean, this building thinks it's in Miami, right? This is a fountain with flamingos. But over here, and I'm sorry you can only see a little bit of it, this is a Bronx apartment house with the sun shining behind it, lining up with the Daily News and the Empire State Building. But the best of them all, I think, was this. And I asked him, what on earth is that? It looks like an aqueduct in a Greek temple. And so he smiled, and he said, well, I had a book of French ironwork, and I saw this image, and I decided I was going to use it. He said, this is the Parthenon. Granddaddy of all classicism, right? This is the architect, the young architect, and this is his new building, and he's presenting it to the Parthenon. So I read this as Marvin Fine having just thrown over his classical training and gone Art Deco, and he's basically coming back and saying, Daddy, Is it okay? So these buildings are up and down the concourse. When I first heard about Art Deco in the concourse, I had this image of a 4.5-mile boulevard lined with Art Deco buildings, and of course that's not what it's like at all. It was mostly built up. Every so many blocks there's an empty space, and the jazz and color of Art Deco just brighten the place up. But they really do, and that's where your eye goes as you're going up the concourse, and you can't help it. Famous buildings like the Fish Building, which everybody seems to love. The people who live here, by the way, always invite tour groups in. They know that this building is famous, they know that people like it, and they're very, very proud of it, which is very nice. Art Deco is all over the 4 boroughs. Just a few things. Here is the Kurtz Brother department store from Jamaica with windows that actually suggest a skyscraper. Wonderful, brightly colored glazed terracotta. Almendinger and Schlendorf. Schlendorf was still alive. 1981. My colleague at Landmarks, Ginny Kershan, found him. Wrote him a letter. He wrote back and he said, well, you know, we have to remember Jamaica still Avenue had the L. Very noisy, and people were up here. And he said, the owners asked me to design something that would catch the attention of the people in the elevator. Something, colorful. Art Deco. So that is what they got. Churches are unusual in the Deco. In fact, there were people writing about this in the architectural journals at the time said, Chrysler Building, the Daily News Building, but churches are more traditional. They're going to stick with Gothic and Romanesque because they're traditional institutions. And generally they did, with a few exceptions, especially Catholic churches, which Henry J. McGill, and for a while his partner Talbot Hamlet, designed the most extraordinary Art Deco churches. This is in Astoria. Look at these wonderful peacocks in the middle of the tower. And inside it just goes on and on. It's spectacular, and there are a lot more. This is, as far as we know, the only surviving Art Deco nightclub in New York City. It's out in Jamaica. It was built as La Casina. Today, here back then it was the Jamaica Development something or other. Now it's a dental office, but it's still standing because it's a landmark. Movie theaters. This is the Midway. It's still there. The inside's been trashed, but the outside, but no, it's 1941. It's really heading into the modern, if you want to get picky about it. But it's there. Brooklyn, the subway. This is where, most of the subway says its name implies underground, but at points it comes up, and this is at 4th Avenue and 9th Street in Brooklyn, where the F train, I think, comes up. And they had to be above ground. Squire Vickers, that's his name, not his title, Squire J. Vickers, recounted, and so he wrote this somewhere, that the neighborhood heard that there was going to be this big thing above ground, and they were afraid it was going to be some monstrosity that would ruin the neighborhood. So he got orders from whatever the equivalent of the MTA was back then, to do something nice. And so he created this extraordinary piece of architecture. It's simple, it's just brick, but by moving, and some other stuff too, but by making the brick rippled and vertical, it's a wonderful Art Deco design, and it's still there. Sears Roebuck, they're always Art Deco from this period, but really in Brooklyn you have these wonderful apartment buildings done by a completely different set of architects that were working in the Bronx. They had their own organization, the Brooklyn Society of Architects. They didn't seem to cross borders. The Bronx was the Bronx, and Brooklyn and Queens were just other group of guys. And it's the same thing, I think, in the 30s. These are inexpensive buildings to build, but that style kind of works with that. All you have to do is change the pattern of the brick. I mean, that's something, but it's not nearly as complicated as hiring 2 dozen stone carvers. Get a piece of cast stone somewhere and change the color, and you've got a stylish, modern design. My favorite, I think everybody's favorite, really, this is in Brighton Beach, where Brooklyn meets the Atlantic. This is 711 Brightwater Court. And what a stunning entrance it is. It's all glazed terracotta. And there it sits a block away from the beach, and a very good Russian restaurant, incidentally. Staten Island has very little, 5 buildings. There were 6, one of them's gone, 5 Art Deco buildings that I could find. This is the Ambassador Apartments. It's the only Art Deco apartment building in Staten Island, and it looks like it got lost on its way to the Bronx. But it has this wonderful Art Deco glazed terracotta piece. Used to have, these doors are very plain now, but they used to have 6-foot-tall, I think they were ostriches in metal. They're gone because the past owner said, I can sell those. And so he did, to a second-hand store somewhere. So that's really a shame. But this is still there. There's the Lane Theater. Now this is a landmark. This is not. This needs to become, but this is. This is a little later. This is 37, 38. There is no movie theater like this anywhere else that I've ever seen, because you've got this speed line here and then the lettering of the name spelled out. And inside, the inside is the landmark. The outside isn't. Modernistic fantasy of the stars and the planets. So this is the style, because you can't talk about this without at least mentioning Rockefeller Center, so I'm just going to mention it because we've got to stop. But this is the great urban wonderland in the middle of Midtown Manhattan, and Raymond Hood was the chief, one of the chief designers, probably the chief designer before he died. He died in '34. There is his RCA Tower, and there's the Daily News building. They're different. This is symmetrically organized, this is asymmetrically organized, but it's the same verticality. There's a lot that is similar. They're only like 2 or 3 years in difference in age. So, when these buildings were built, they were the newest and the latest and the modern, and everything was, wow, look what's going on. And now they're 90 years old and they're official historic landmarks. This is actually from 1982, or earlier. This is a cake in the shape of the RCA building. That is David Rockefeller slicing a piece off, celebrating its 50th anniversary. And these days it would be more like, 90 years old, 85, whatever it should be. And these buildings continue, even though so much has been built since then, they continue to give the city so much of its physical identity. When you see the Chrysler building at night, you know you're in New York, you couldn't be anywhere else. These are the buildings that do that for us, and long may they wave. Thank you. I'd be glad to answer questions if anybody's still willing to sit here and ask. Yes?
Of course.
What buildings would you wish that you could put in except that they're no longer standing?
Oh, well, actually, not that many have disappeared. Skyscrapers don't get torn down that frequently. The old International Airlines terminal at right across the street, where the Philip Morris building is now, opposite Grand Central Terminal, that was a real loss. That's a little later, something 1940, but that's one that comes to mind. The Horn and Hardart Automat that used to be on 57th Street, just west of 6th Avenue. My humble opinion should have been a landmark, but it was, in the opinion of the commission, a little bit too altered, and down it came. The Knickerbocker Industrial Laundry in somewhere, I forget, Western Queens, I forget the neighborhood.
Sunnyside Yards.
Thank you, it's their Sunnyside Yards, which is still there, but it's been turned into a church and it's been really trashed. It's really a shame. I'm happy to say there aren't too many. The Waldorf Astoria is, as you probably know, has just been closed and it's undergoing a 3-year renovation, restoration, I'm not quite sure which. And there was some concern that although the outside was a landmark, I wrote the report back in the 80s, the interior hadn't been designated. So the Art Deco Society of New York, of which I am now happily a board member, together with the Historic Districts Council, using modern social media that I am too old to understand, but they arranged for 300 people to show up and waltz through the building before it closed and got the Landmarks Commission's attention, and by God, they calendared a bunch of interior spaces, heard of them designated, and they're not going to be hurt by the, and that's a good thing. The Coney Island Pumping Station in Brooklyn has been trashed, and that's a real shame. It could still be, it would take money to be put back, but that's about all I can come up with.
Singer Building.
Singer Building isn't really Art Deco, otherwise I would love to have it. Tallest building ever demolished before the World Trade Center, of course. Was there another question? Sir?
I know you started your presentation by saying this is going to be very specific to New York, but you also mentioned that the Art Deco style is global in a lot of ways. And I come from Johannesburg, which is supposed to have quite a strong Art Deco, I suppose, trend in its architecture at a certain point in time. I was wondering if you were aware of any relationship between New York's Art Deco and
I don't know about Johannesburg was the site of the World Congress on Art Deco 6 or 8 years ago. So I mean, we're aware of it. Even here in New York, we are aware of it. I don't know. I have been out in, there's a World Congress every other year, and they alternate between North America and someplace else. The first one I went to was in Perth, in Western Australia. And it was wonderful to see things that looked like home, but they didn't look like home. There's always a local flavor to things, whether it's something as simple as a department store with Art Deco kangaroos, which you wouldn't see in New York, you'd only see in Australia. But then I was staying with people who lived in a subdivision that was called Hollywood. And Australia is a special case. It's the only country I've been in, besides in Canada, where the architecture is seriously influenced by American architecture. They got Frank Lloyd Wright influence, they have California bungalows in Sydney, which they call cowbones. But it is remarkable. England, it's different. They don't have skyscrapers. I think that's a major difference. I mean, you can recognize it. You spot it, you know that it's Art Deco. But I think there is a local flavor.
I would add, though, that a lot of what happens in the 30s comes out of Europe, and especially France, and is described by colonialism. And the show that was in Paris at the Palais Tokyo, or I forget exactly where it was, about 5 years ago, I think it was called Les Années 20, something like that, about Art Deco, had a whole section. Its centerpiece was the Exposition des Arts Décoratifs, and then the impact of that and the spread of it came through French colonialism to many parts of Africa. So I would say I would look to that as a source.
But on the other hand, Bombay has an Art Deco district. Bandung in Indonesia. I mean, you know, the 25 exposition also brought things in from all over the world too. It was an exposition of things that already existed. The only country of note that didn't participate was the United States.
Right.
Apparently, whoever was asked the question said, "Oh, well, we don't have modern."
Herbert Hoover. I
Was it
think
Hubert Hoover?
Yes.
Well, there you go.
He was Secretary of Commerce.
Yes, ma'am.
Can I ask about Art Deco tribute building? On 57th Street, the Four Seasons Hotel has this tower and lighting, and it's the Four Seasons Hotel in East 57?
Yes.
Oh,
It's got something that looks like the Waldorf Towers.
you can see these things. There was, in fact, it was more in the 90s. In the 90s, there was definitely a let's revive Art Deco. Not a lot, but there's some, and some people called it Deco Echo. And there's one glass and steel building. It's on 50, I want to say between 50th and 49th on the west side of Park Avenue. So, and it goes like this. And it's clearly not a 30s building, but it's also clearly reflecting the style. So there are not a lot of them as far as that, but they do exist. Yes, they do. Are we all exhausted? Because I know I am.
So we have actually plenty of books because Tony brought his own books, and they're the ones that are around the corner over there.
Okay.
So I will thank Tony, of course, but in particular, I hope that you will get a guidebook and assign one and take it around and really enjoy on your own. But there's nothing better to enjoy it with Tony narrating. So
Thank you. It's not required, by the way.
Which was called Downtown New York, and this is relevant for our next exhibition, which I'll preview a little bit now. In 1996 and 7 was the founding the museum and our first exhibition. And it came very much out of the scholarship that I had been doing for the 10 or 15 years even before that as a graduate student at Columbia in the art history department. So I'm an architectural historian and not an architect. And back in those days when I was studying, and you'll see in some of his slides, which I just took a peek at, when I was studying at Columbia in art history, there were two architectural historians teaching there, George Collins, who was a specialist in modernism, and then Rosemary Bletter, that some of you may know, who teaches and has taught at CUNY in the Graduate Center, and she was then the junior art historian on the faculty. And Rosemary had just published a book, some of you may know, called Skyscraper Style Art Deco New York. And I think that must have been in about 1983 or something like that. And at that time, it was very, very edgy within the domain, within the study of architectural history, to venture out into a topic like Art Deco, which was considered to be the kind of bastard child of modernism. And it was though, as you'll see in the lecture, it started in Europe. It became an American phenomenon. And I have to say that my work in the 1920s, and especially with skyscrapers on Art Deco, was really to make an argument that modernism in New York was rooted in an American response to modernism, not an adoption of European principles of the international style, the early Le Corbusier. So if we looked at that same period in Europe at the same time, you would have the Bauhaus, you would have Le Corbusier, you would have a series of young Turks who were fighting against the École des Beaux-Arts, or fighting against an idea of modernism that modeled their buildings around the idea of space and openness, like an airiness and openness. And by contrast, and you'll see this in the slides because I just saw them, New York architects who thought of themselves as commercial architects, who thought of themselves not as so much as artists, but working within a building tradition and working closely with clients rather than expressing a theoretical idea about what our architecture would be, found in the skyscraper, lo and behold, this subject, this category that I was studying, a response that seemed to be purely American, because the American commercial motive was expressed nowhere better than in the skyscraper. America invented two building types in the, say, if you look at the broad spectrum of history of architecture, the suburban house and the skyscraper. These are our claim to fame in the history of architecture. So New York, more than any other place, became the birthplace of the skyscraper, especially in the 1920s. Not to, set aside the achievements of Chicago, especially earlier in the 1880s and 1890s, especially when Chicago architects were very clearly looking for a path to modernism through commercial building style. And so we think of Louis Sullivan and the Halliburton Roach and Burnham and Root, a whole group of architects who also practiced within commercial architecture an idea about finding an expression, a purely modern expression, for this most modern building type, the skyscraper. And so in New York, the idea of a building which was a kind of pyramid, like our Art Deco setback skyscrapers, had an expression which was, they argued, uniquely modern and uniquely American and very modern. And it was an architecture of mass, not of volume, right? So it wasn't like the Bauhaus, an envelope of space with a skin of glass or ribbon windows stretched around it. Instead, it was this kind of mountain of shaped masses. And that came out of, and I have to say that, my awareness of this came through studying the work of Hugh Ferris, who imagined all these future cities. The Metropolis of Tomorrow was his great 1929 book. But Ferris came to that idea of the skyscraper of the future through the New York City zoning law of 1916, and the idea of sculpting a block of a building by the laws of the zoning setback and by the laws of an angle of light. So, and he's got the slides there, through that idea of adapting to the conditions of place, the kind of vernacular of New York. Ferris and the people that he influenced, like Harvey Wiley Corbett and Raymond Hood and a bunch of, and Eli Jacques Hahn especially, and others, came up with an idea of an American skyscraper, which they then decorated, I would argue, in the Art Deco style, a style that was adopted from European modernism, from the architecture of the Exposition des Arts Décoratifs. Come on in, I'm not Tony Robbins, but I'm talking about Art Deco while we wait for him to arrive from his stopped subway. So there's some seats in the front here. I hope you're not all as hot as I am getting in the hot seat here, talking just off the cuff from Tony's slides we haven't seen yet. So the skyscraper played an enormously important part in the idea of the birth of modernism in America through a New York style, and actually Chicago adopted the New York style because of the enormous dominance in New York among architects and engineers and in the publications of the period. But it was very looked down upon by academia, by especially the publications in the 1930s, and there were only a few publications that kind of accepted and celebrated the buildings of this new style, whereas the critics, keep hoping that's going to be Tony coming in, the critics of the day, like Philip Johnson, who was writing, and Lewis Mumford, all disdained the American architects of the time, and they celebrated the theoretical Europeans. And since I already saw his slides, I can go forward to some like this. So we have buildings like the Chrysler Building, where you can see in every way the contrast to a European idea of what modernism is. This is very figurative. And because his book is about jazz, New York Art Deco, the Guide to Gotham's Jazz Age Architecture, and this, William Van Allen does look very jazzy with all his diamonds and points of light, and the use of metal and the materials of the machine age. So but you can see that bears no relation to the Bauhaus, which is all about streamlining and horizontal and a sense of interior volumes. So I think that's the most fundamental reconsideration of what Art Deco was as a legitimate style in the history of architecture and study of the history of architecture in about the 1980s or so. Nobody looked, because we were all being schooled in the modern masters, in the architecture of the orthodoxy of the international style. And Frank Lloyd Wright, has everybody seen the Frank Lloyd Wright show at the Museum of Modern Art now? So that, for those of you who haven't, you have to go down and see it because it's just a spectacular extravaganza of so much of the work of Wright. I mean, just sampling the work of Wright, but so there's so much of every building or every category that's studied in that exhibition that you just begin to sample like a tasting menu, the various approaches that he explores, all of which were contrary, if cognizant at the same time, of European movements. So we had only one American architect who was considered modern at the time, but he was modern in 1900, and by 1930 he had kind of moved off the stage, pushed off the stage by the European theorists. So the Art Deco was the kind of, as I said before, I can't get it out of my mind, the kind of bastard child of modernism, disdained by the critics, and nobody really studied it for all those years. It became even more outre than it was when it was created at the time, in about 1930, as the orthodoxy of international style really took hold. So in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, nobody looked at that. It was just considered to be, pastiche and a lot of silly practitioners. And then it began to be rediscovered, or not really rediscovered, but appreciated and reinterpreted by a series of scholars like Rosemary Bletter, who wrote the Skyscraper style Art Deco in New York. And the Art Deco how many of you are members of the Art Deco Society? Oh, look at that. No, that's surprising. Because they tend to travel in packs anyway. Say the words Art Deco, a whole bunch of them show up at that time, usually dressed in a bow tie and a white linen suit. Those aficionados of Art Deco tended to be collectors and interested especially in the decorative arts. So the idea of Art Deco as decoration and applied to the form of architecture was the way that the critics of the Skyscraper and this Art Deco modernistic style felt that it was failing, or it was secondary in importance. But from the 1980s or so, as these books began to explore the foundations, the influences, really the art history that underpins the period, a lot through the study of the decorative arts, one began to see the differences between the 1930s and the 1940s, a more floral, decorative, machine age, kind of machine imagery in the 1920s through the 30s, and then a streamlined kind of automobile, kind of sensitive speed style of Henry Dreyfuss and a whole series of graphic designers and industrial designers in the period. So that kind of movement within a period within a style that lasted 20 years or so, and its influence began to be studied as a thing unto itself, and had more and more scholars, serious scholars, looking into the biographies and monographs like the people, architects like Eli Jacques Kahn or Ralph Walker, who now have all been studied. And when I did my very first exhibition was on Raymond Hood, he was someone who was, Kyle was remembering.
I'm waiting for you to talk.
Raymond
It's the
Hood.
bridge to the connection.
Yeah, well, an enormously inventive architect and someone who really figured out how, as we can see his picture here, if Tony doesn't arrive soon, an architect who went against type, who went against the conventions of the moment, where most people were making this setback style. Who would figure out with the RCA building, Rockefeller Center, how to make a tower, the Daily News building, to make the building go straight up. Architects played even within the conventions of style that would undergird an argument that these were not artists of the first class. And clearly they were not Frank Lloyd Wright, as you see when you go to MoMA, but Raymond Hood was a great architect and someone who really understood, who was born of his moment and reflected the conditions of the period and worked within the constraints of the moment, the zoning code and all of that. So these architects have now been explored. I would say decorative arts in particular have been explored. How many of you have seen the exhibition at the Cooper Hewitt about Jazz Age? No, not that many. There's really a lot of material in that show. It has diamonds galore, so if you like jewels and everything, but what you see when you go to that exhibition, which is also has Jazz Age as the subtitle in order to present the material, it goes across the decorative arts from wallpaper to ladies' dresses and hats and furniture and cars, and I can't remember, kind of all the other things that are the different objects that reflect this kind of new spirit that's being communicated. But that idea of Art Deco as something which has a commercial application is also another thing that tainted it within the architectural hierarchy of what was considered to be the first order of style, with kind of theoretical pure thought, pure expression, the Corbusier and his manifestos, and an architecture which was consistent across an argument about what style should be, and prescriptive for other people to follow. New York Art Deco, and I think American architecture, Art Deco is much more reflective of a kind of, not populist, but a popular spirit about what it means to embrace modernism. So that would be my take on it. I'll look at my phone and find out where he is now to find out if I should be. Yes, he's here.
Having already been butted in once, can I add something to what you're saying?
Sure. Architect Kyle Johnson.
About Raymond Hood, I think maybe underestimates his position in all of this. He actually, I think, kind of bridged the gap. You were suggesting that the modern international style Bauhaus stuff was one thing, and the commercial American Art Deco was something else. And I think Hood kind of bridges that gap, actually. I mean, the American Radiator Building on Bryant Park is probably more toward the Art Deco end of that, but then he did the Daily News Building, as you mentioned, on East 42nd Street, and the McGraw Hill Building on West 42nd Street, which actually did qualify under Philip Johnson and Russell Hitchcock's
I have some here. Yeah, keep talking.
criteria for modern architecture from the international style, and yet it also has...
he started here.
Also has various decorative motifs. I think he kind of bridges that gap. Take it away.
Yes, I mean, I don't disagree with you, and I revere Raymond Hood, and defend him against the many slights. But sorry, he's no Frank Lloyd Wright, right? I mean, in the pantheon of architects, he's a great American architect, but he doesn't measure up to Frank Lloyd Wright. Tony is so close he can taste it, he says. Third email. He was at Liberty Street not that long ago at 6:58. That's 5 minutes ago. So I think he should be walking through the door very, very soon. But Yeah, here's, I guess that's all we have of Raymond Hood. I just did a quick look through there. Well, Kyle, why don't you tell us about Docomomo and Art Deco? Because Kyle is an officer of the documentation of the modern movement in architecture. Do you all know Docomomo? No, do not know. Well, please, educate them as to. Why don't you stand up, because I'm sure Tony's going to be
ready for this one. I'm a board member of Docomomo, which stands for this very cumbersome appellation of the documentation and conservation of the buildings, sites, and neighborhoods of the modern movement.
And tell us what modern movement means.
A European organization which has branches all over the world, and we have local branches of the U.S., and I'm on the board of the New York Tri-State chapter. Yeah, we're focused on the quote modern movement, as you just say, which is much more the Bauhaus international style stuff we're talking about. There are those of us on the board who think modernism should be interpreted a little more broadly than that. I give walking tours also for the AIA New York chapter. We look at a lot of Art Deco buildings as sort of early examples of modernism. They're putting modern decorative motifs into buildings. That's already a step away from the historical eclecticism of the 19th century. What Docomomo does, we try to educate people and advocate for the preservation of important modern buildings. Since you set me off here, I might note that there are a few very significant mid-century modern buildings in East Midtown, which have been somehow overlooked by the task force as connected with making sure that all the important architectural landmarks of East Midtown are protected before the East Midtown upzoning moves forward. Those particular buildings are the most significant of those buildings that include the Carbide headquarters from the 1800s.
Here he is! Come on up! I did the first 25 minutes on Art Deco, so now they're going to help. Welcome.
Tony, give me one moment to finish what I was just saying.
So we're getting a little pitch for Docomomo and distinguishing between modernisms.
Manhattan headquarters, 270 Park Avenue, the former Girl Scouts headquarters at 50th Street, 51st Street, and